Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher, but to be perfectly honest, he considered himself a good European, and most of his mature life was spent outside of Germany, primarily in Switzerland and northern Italy. He was born in 1844 in a small German town, a family that went back several generations of Protestant preachers. He spent most of his life in particularly ill health, and in 1889 he collapsed in a state of insanity and spent the last tragic 10 years of his life virtually in a vegetative state. He died in 1900, rather prophetically, because he had much to say about what he expected of the new century. He was trained as a classical philologist, something he showed great talent for when he was in school. And at an astoundingly young age, in his early 20s, he became a professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He spent about 10 years teaching, but resigned because of poor health, spent the rest of his life, his sane life anyway, wandering in some of the more exotic resort places in Europe. He was influenced, first as a student, by a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer, and from Schopenhauer he got a good glimpse of the sorts of things that philosophy could do. Nevertheless, as we'll see, one of the things he firmly rejected was Schopenhauer's pessimism. The most singularly profound personal encounter he had in his life was with the composer Richard Wagner. From Wagner, he came to see himself as not so much a philosopher as a budding musician. And I think we can all be thankful, having heard his compositions, that he finally decided that philosophy was his real skill. But the friendship with Wagner and then the break with Wagner, he described as some of the most traumatic periods of his life, and one can understand a good deal of his philosophy, in fact, in terms of his musical sensibilities. The philosophy itself has some distinctive characteristics. It is thoroughly empirical, but perhaps not empirical in the sense that philosophers who use that name would often endorse. It was thoroughly experimental, and in fact I would say Nietzsche is probably the most experimental of all philosophers. He experiments with ideas, he experiments with worldviews, he experiments most famously with his wonderful philosophical style. He was skeptical, but again, not skeptical in the way that many other philosophers, for example David Hume, would be called skeptics, but he rather instituted what is today called the hermeneutics of suspicion, the idea of looking at everything, particularly those things that are highly praised, with a kind of jaded eye. He was notoriously individualistic, but as we'll see, his individualism is also something that has to be carefully understood. He was not an individualist in the sense, say, of the later existentialists, who would say that people have absolute choices in what they do. He was much more circumscribed in the sense of our limitations than that. He's most famous perhaps for saying, "God is dead," a phrase which in fact he borrows from Hegel, and before that from Luther, and that, as we'll see, permeates a good deal of his philosophy. In this lecture, what I'd like to spend most of my time talking about, however, are two theses that are pretty well known, but I think sometimes are exaggerated in their impact on his overall thought. The first, which I take much more seriously, is the thesis of perspectivism. Not something he named himself, but Nietzsche often talks about perspectives. It's part of his experimental method, and the idea is that we should always take different views of things. We should try and take one way of looking, then another way of looking, and one might say, reminiscent of Hegel, that the truth of things emerges only when we get as many perspectives as possible. And second, there is the notion of the will to power, a rather notorious notion which, especially in the German context and subsequent German history, has a good many overtones that I want to be very careful to diffuse. Perspectivism. Perspectivism is, first of all, critique. It's critique of traditional metaphysics and epistemology. It's a critique of the idea that there is a true world, or that there is a way, an objective way, in which we can understand that world. Traditional philosophy is often divided into the distinction between appearances and reality. And one might even say the mission of contemporary or modern philosophy is to get through the appearances to reality itself. This is something Nietzsche rejects. And as he famously says, once we get rid of the idea of a true world behind the appearances, then what will disappear as well is the idea of the world as appearances. The word metaphysics, of course, comes from Aristotle. It was also defended throughout most of the philosophical history. Kant questioned it, but nevertheless, he held on to the distinction, which he described as a distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenon world, the world of experience as opposed to the world as it is in itself. And this is just the kind of distinction that Nietzsche wants to say is utterly illegitimate and gets us into all kinds of philosophical problems. Instead, Nietzsche famously says, there are no facts, only interpretations. There is no truth, there are only the errors of mankind. Or, much more modestly, there is no single truth, no God's eye view, no privileged perspective. For example, in his day, science was already becoming sufficiently dominant that it claimed, at least in some circles, to give us the sole truth about things. In his early days, Nietzsche greatly praised science because he saw that science did in fact take on the experimental method. Science was a worldview which did believe in questioning things, which did have a certain kind of healthy skepticism. It required evidence, it required experimentation, and so on. Later, though, Nietzsche came to see that science, too, had become dogmatic and had taken over the view of truth in general. But Nietzsche gives us a set of contrasts. For example, it's one thing to see the world through science and scientific eyes. It's something else to see the world through aesthetic eyes. And generally, I would say, Nietzsche preferred the aesthetics, although he never disowned science and he often used it. But a quick example comes to mind. I was sitting at a cafe with a friend of mine, a poet, and we were looking at a flower on the table, which was, as my poet friend put it, stretching its arms towards the heavens and the sunlight. And being an old biology student, I thought about Turger and all that, and I realized instantly, of course, that his was the better explanation. What Nietzsche wants to say is that, well, there are many perspectives. Science, aesthetics are two of them. A moral perspective would be another. Perhaps a religious perspective, another. And none of these is necessarily better than the others. One might look at this as a kind of deconstructive campaign, much as has been defended in the 20th century by some rather famous French philosophers. I think this isn't right. It is true that Nietzsche has a good deal to say of a negative sort, that much of what he says is critique. The attack on truth, as often understood, is a clear example. But it doesn't follow from this, as what I've already said would suggest, that Nietzsche rejects truth as such. One might say, as a contemporary philosopher has said, maybe there is no truth, but there's still lots of truths. For Nietzsche, I think we should look at this as part of a much more general campaign. In particular, Nietzsche's naturalism, his appreciation of the world, his appreciation of humans and human nature, and his fascination with how people behave and why they behave. All of this is clouded by ideas about another world, whether it's Kant's thing in itself, whether it's Plato's rather ethereal world of being, whether it's the Christian heaven with God, and so on. His thesis of the death of God fits into this thesis too. It doesn't just mean that there is no God and therefore no basis for religion. Much more profoundly, the death of God refers to the idea of there being a single perspective, an objective perspective. Again, the idea of truth. But again, it's not simply a matter of rejecting all of this, so much as replacing it with something better and healthier. So too, when Nietzsche talks about Judeo-Christian morality, this is something which also must be viewed from a perspectival, standpoint. Nietzsche will famously distinguish between two different kinds of morality. And it's important to see that what he's giving us here are two different moral perspectives. But again, it's not simply by way of dismissing all of this, but rather replacing it with something that's better. One might say of Nietzsche that he was a pragmatic Darwinist with regard to epistemology. Now, Darwin preceded Nietzsche by a few decades. His works were very well known. Nietzsche expresses rather mixed attitudes towards Darwin, some I think because of misunderstanding. But the one thing I think that is undebatable is that Darwin's general view, namely the idea that humanity is continuous with the animal kingdom, the idea that we have to explain in purely naturalistic ways how species came about, and in particular how human beings came about. All of this to Nietzsche is very close to the heart. With regard to knowledge and with regard to perspectivism, I think one can put this in a very dramatic way. When Nietzsche says there is no truth, there are only the errors of mankind, or referring back to Kant, when he says there is no synthetic a priori truth, there are only those errors, there are only those schemes which we can't throw off. I think what he's referring to is something that can very nicely be put in a kind of Darwinian scheme. You imagine, for example, two kinds of creatures, some of whom believe, as we do, that, for example, the future will be like the past. The laws of nature are more or less constant. That if lightning strikes in one place, it's very likely to strike in such a place again, as opposed to another set of creatures who don't believe the future is going to be like the past, who don't believe in particular that if lightning strikes one place, then it's likely to strike there again, but to the contrary, if lightning strikes in one place, then there's virtually little chance that it'll ever strike there again. It's not too hard to see which of those two sets of creatures is going to survive. And so the idea that the future will be like the past is going to be something which is eventually going to be built into, if not our genes, certainly into our education in such a way that it becomes a necessity for us. So Nietzsche has a kind of answer to people like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, the first of whom thought we had to be very skeptical about such principles, the second of whom said they were built into the very structure of human mind. Nietzsche would say neither of these, but rather these are things we believe because they have been practical. These are things that we believe because they have proven to be for the benefit of the species. And of course the same sort of thing might be said of individuals. Philosophies are not just abstract ideas which are defended by philosophers on the basis of some ethereal intuition. Philosophy, Nietzsche says, is almost always the confession and the unconscious memoir of the philosopher. The ideas defended are the ideas that make the philosopher, to put it very crudely, feel good about himself. One might compare Nietzsche then to American pragmatism as well, the kind of notion that what is true is what works. And this isn't exactly right as far as Nietzsche is concerned, because what is true might also be what is beautiful. But I think the idea of getting rid of metaphysics and getting rid of traditional epistemology, getting rid of the kind of skepticism that leaves us with nothing, is very much in tune with both Nietzsche and the pragmatists. With regard to the will to power, there is a whole host of misunderstandings that surround this. In the first place, of course, power is a word that in the history of Germany makes people's blood curl. It was certainly greatly prone to abuse. During Nietzsche's own lifetime, Bismarck was unifying Germany, and it would be a great mistake to think that the kind of power celebrated and manifested by Bismarck is the kind of power that was celebrated by Nietzsche. Quite to the contrary. Nietzsche makes great fun of Bismarck. He obviously despised him. He thought this was a vulgar sense of power. And the word that Nietzsche uses for power, in fact, refers to something that I think more likely should be considered as personal strength, rather than anything like political power or power over other people. As for the idea of the will to power, it's rather a striking phrase, both in English and in German. And Nietzsche obviously was quite enamored of it. He uses it throughout his philosophy. But the first thing to say is that the notion of the will to power is clearly borrowed from Schopenhauer, who, as I said, was one of Nietzsche's mentors early on, but Nietzsche came to reject Schopenhauer. And he rejected not just the pessimism, but, as he put it in one of his later, more nasty aphorisms, everything that Schopenhauer ever said. For Schopenhauer, the will was reality. The will was really the core of the world. But of course, that runs very much against Nietzsche's notion of perspectivism, where there is no God's eye view, there is no objective reality. But it seems like the will would be just that. The will would be the thing in itself, and Nietzsche rejects the thing in itself. So he has great suspicions about the very idea of the will to power. So I'd want to say that right away we should be suspicious about the will. We should be suspicious about what he says about power. And as I say, the way to do it would be, first of all, to understand it in terms of a kind of personal strength, rather than as something political or something having to do with your role vis-a-vis other people. It's also suggested that there is the will to power, and this would make sense for Schopenhauer, for whom, in an important sense, it must be singular, but it doesn't make sense for Nietzsche, because the truth is, as he talks about the will to power and its various manifestations, it's quite clear that it is not one thing, but it's many. Now, there are two ways of thinking about the will to power in Nietzsche. First of all, and I'll talk about this much more because I think it's much more plausible, there's the notion of the will to power as a species of motivation. Second, there is the will to power as a metaphysical entity. But as I said, the will to power as a metaphysical entity just rubs against everything else Nietzsche says about perspectivism and objectivity. And it seems to me that while he does talk this way occasionally in his unpublished notes, and I'm very hesitant to take those unpublished notes very seriously, it's pretty clear in his published works that the will to power rather refers to the first thing I said, and that is a kind of theory of motivation. To see how this works, I think we should contrast the will to power against its most likely opponent, and that is, throughout the history of philosophy, the idea of hedonism, the idea that we, and in fact most creatures, act in the pursuit of pleasure, or at least to avoid pain. This has often struck people as not only plausible, but as so obvious it doesn't require much defense. You find it back in the Greeks. Aristotle took great pains to refute it in favor of his own theory of ethics. You find it in particular in current British philosophy, and especially the philosophy of utilitarianism. It was defended by Jeremy Bentham, the founder of that movement, John Stuart Mill, its most famous advocate, in terms of the underlying principle which governed human behavior and consequently the underlying concern for ethics. Well, what Nietzsche thinks, and in fact here he joins with a great many German philosophers, is that hedonism, this pursuit of pleasure, avoidance of pain philosophy, is just plain vulgar. It's not what people actually behave on the basis of, but rather it's just a kind of anomaly, or it's something secondary. In one of his nastiest aphorisms, Nietzsche says, with particular reference to John Stuart Mill, "Man does not seek pleasure, only the Englishman does." For Nietzsche, the idea was that what we seek is power. But again, we have to be very careful how to understand this. When we seek power, what we're seeking is what I think might better be referred to as status, but status is still too much of a social concept, so I think maybe let's use the current, a little bit overly Californian notion of self-esteem. If you look to see how people behave, they rarely act out of pleasure, and they rarely, in fact, act in their own advantage, construed in terms of pleasure and pain. Most people do what they do to achieve some kind of status, to feel good about themselves. This is true of Christian martyrs. This is true of students taking courses they don't really like. This is true of people who work for a living but don't really like their jobs. This is true of people who get married because they think they ought to. This is true of people who are heroic because they don't want to embarrass themselves in front of their fellow soldiers or congressmen. The truth is that people behave primarily for the sake of what we can call, but misleadingly, power. And Nietzsche looks through the history of human behavior and sees very clearly that most of what people do can be much better understood by this power hypothesis than it can by the hedonistic hypothesis. So the will to power, so construed, says something about why we do what we do. We don't just act in pursuit of potential pleasures, and we aren't necessarily all that averse to pain. If you think about the pain, the kind of general mental suffering, emotional suffering, not to mention the physical suffering, that we often put ourselves through for the sake of thinking better of ourselves, for the sake of elevating ourselves in the eyes of our fellow men, for the sake of being virtuous. This leads to a general moral theory for which Nietzsche is very famous, and we'll talk about this more in the next lecture. But the will to power also describes the very different ways in which people behave, and in particular, the very different ways in which people consider morality. Morality, like all human behavior, is basically an expression of the will to power. But morality can take many different forms. The expression of the will to power can take many different forms. Here, too, we find Nietzsche as a perspectivist. There's the perspective of the strong, perspective of those who are healthy, those who are talented. And for them, the expression of the will to power is to manifest and to exercise their talents, their abilities, to the greatest amount possible. But on the other hand, there are some people who don't have much power. In fact, Nietzsche would say most people are rather impoverished when it comes to power. It's not as if they don't have a will to power, but their exercise of it is going to be reactive. It's going to be, in a way, distorted. So that he talks about the reactive resentment of the least powerful in society. And morality, as we know it, is precisely this kind of expression of will to power, namely the will to power of those who don't have much power. The entire Judeo-Christian tradition is like this. So too, the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, Nietzsche would say, is a manifestation of it. In the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular, what you see is basically a morality of the weak, which is buttressed by a rather elaborate and sometimes frightening theological picture. But the truth of it is that the will to power in the Judeo-Christian moral tradition is defensive. And this is where Nietzsche introduces his notion of master and slave morality, the subject of the next lecture, and the idea that genealogically, in other words, looking back at its roots, what we call morality has to be understood in terms of precisely this impoverished expression of the will to power. Now, all this talk about power, not to mention the kinds of things he talks about with reference to perspectivism, where perspectivism can easily be understood in contemporary terms as a kind of relativism, or even, contrary to Nietzsche's own wishes, a kind of nihilism. And combine that with the idea of the will to power understood in terms of a certain kind of political attitude, it's not surprising that Nietzsche was often accused of being a Nazi, or rather a proto-Nazi, since the Nazi Party wasn't formed until nearly 30 years after his death. But the truth is, Nietzsche was absolutely no Nazi, even though he defended some themes that the Nazis gladly embraced. For example, the idea of self-assertion. He was certainly a very aggressive writer and philosopher. The idea of eugenics, the idea of breeding people for their better traits. But of course, what the Nazis took from this was utterly distorted and perverted. And let me say, just for the record, with no qualifications whatsoever, that Nietzsche was no Nazi. He despised what they stood for. The truth is, Nietzsche had a sister with whom he was actually quite close for most of their young lives. But Nietzsche's sister married a character named Forster, who was what we would call a proto-Nazi, who was definitely an anti-Semite, and he converted or persuaded Nietzsche's sister into some similar views. When Nietzsche went insane in 1889 and was no longer capable of looking after himself or his affairs, Nietzsche's sister and his mother took over his literary estate. When the mother died, the sister pretty much ran away with what Nietzsche had done. She did what Nietzsche himself was never capable of doing and promoted his works, but she promoted them with a certain kind of slant. In fact, she even took his unpublished notes, and my attitude towards unpublished notes is there's always a reason why they're unpublished, but Nietzsche's sister published them as if they were Nietzsche's works. In fact, there is some suggestion that she even forged some of them, and they weren't Nietzsche's at all. But what this did was it gave Nietzsche's own work a kind of Nazi tint. And in the early 30s, just after Hitler had been elected to power, there is a very famous picture set up by Nietzsche's sister of Hitler staring at the bust of Nietzsche. But it was Nietzsche's bust, not Nietzsche. Nietzsche himself probably would have spit in the dictator's face. And I think it's very important, given the history of Nietzsche scholarship, given the history of Nazi Nietzsche scholarship in particular, to say that Nietzsche was himself very much an anti-Semite. In fact, one of his last rather raving comments was that he thought he would have all anti-Semites shot. Nietzsche himself was a rather benign character. From people at the time, we get descriptions of him as thoroughly courteous, kind, a quiet person, not the kind of raving lunatic you would expect from many of his texts, which are filled with exclamation marks and all sorts of wild insults. The truth is that Nietzsche was an exemplar of a different kind of view. And what we'd like to do in the next lecture is try to make it clear exactly what that view amounts to.